Chicken legs?
Chicken legs.
Special display.
Like clowns.
Yeah.
No.
Pennywise. Yes.
Good evening and welcome to the City Council Conference Meeting of Tuesday, December 10th, 2024. One item on the agenda, the AIM Norman Comprehensive Plan Update.
I think that's me.
That's you.
Well, thanks, everyone. This is a pleasure to be back here. And so we wanted to give you an update on the land use and AIM overall and share a little bit of some of the things that will also be being shared tonight and tomorrow at the open houses. So primarily we'll focus on where we're at with regards to the land use, but I also have a few things in here that'll just be so you can see what might be shared tomorrow or tonight and tomorrow at the open houses too. So just as a little reminder in this process for everybody, this is both a quantitative and qualitative process, and the qualitative is very important to what we're doing. And as part of that, I should have checked the fonts. We have our website in the last 60 days has had nearly 3,000 new visitors for a total of 21,000 visits to the site. In the monthly polling questions that what we were doing earlier in the process, we've had about 3,000 responses, over 3,000 responses to that, to those monthly polling questions. 34 pop-up events at which we've had about 192 comments left, and 15 steering committees, and all the subcommittees together, they've met 29 times now together. So lots of great conversations and discussions that have helped lead us through the process. Tonight we'll be talking a little bit about what each of the plans is. You're very aware of those, but I want to jump right into what's kind of guiding us in this process as we've worked through and heard from the community about what are the priorities and what we framed as the development principles. And I think one of the key things that we heard consistently up to this point was the prioritization of Lake Thunderbird and the protection of the Garber-Wellington aquifer and managing growth around those. And really, how do we continue to manage that growth into the future while making sure that we're creating opportunities for the next generation? And that's really a passion of mine when I think about planning. How are we planning for our children and grandchildren and the next generation in the place they can hopefully call home here in Norman? So the development principles, there's 10. These aren't in prioritization. It's just to note that there are 10 development principles. The first one being managing our urban services as efficiently as we possibly can, promoting diverse housing options throughout the community. This is, again, a key priority we've heard from folks. Promoting infill development and neighborhood reinvestment, so continuing to invest in what we have today, and that obviously ties back to that infrastructure piece too. Protecting the environment in all the decisions that we're making, and making sure that we're enhancing distinctive neighborhoods and business districts and natural areas with kind of a strong sense of place. Providing multimodal and connected transportation network. We've heard a lot about trails and connected trail system throughout this process. Enhancing our public safety and really minimizing any hazards that we potentially have. Encouraging balanced and connected neighborhoods. Making development decisions that are predictable and fair and cost effective, and then finally just making sure we're all doing this in the most transparent way possible as we move forward. So those are kind of the 10 principles, and we'll talk a little bit about how those tie back. And as we're working through each one of the master plans, one of the things we're also looking at is how do the goals and the strategies and the policies and the programs and so forth that are happening in each one of those master plans tie back to these development principles too. So as I mentioned, we want to spend a little bit more time kind of just talking about the land use plan. And this is something we've been trying to provide you with some updates. But one of the things we wanted to make sure that we really emphasize is this really is a different approach for Norman than what you've done in the past, and it's really driven by what we've heard from the community. Now, I will say it's a different approach from your existing plan that you have today, but it's not different from the way and what we're seeing other communities around the nation doing right now. So the land use plan is built around two maps right now. The first is the character area map, which is really the big broad picture, how the built environment fits together at a bigger level. and then our land use map, which is the map that you've been working under and are very used to working with. And that's how we want to see land uses at a more specific area level. So delving into this a little bit deeper, the character area map, as I mentioned, is how the kind of the larger built environment fits together. These areas formulate policies for new development that is tailored to kind of the unique features of that area. So the city is divided into 7 kind of character areas that share common challenges and opportunities. And if you remember right, this is a really important piece. We've spent several months working with the committee. They've put a lot of time and effort and thought and given us a lot of feedback on this to get to where we are today on that. The second map then is the land use map. And as I said, this is the one that you probably are a little bit more familiar with. But this is also different. The land use map and the land use approach here is different from what your existing is today. So existing today, it's a little bit more, I often describe it as kind of siloed. This is where we're going to have residential, and this is where we're going to have commercial, and this is where we're going to have jobs. What we heard in the community and really is kind of national trends is we want things kind of more convenient, mixing our uses together a little bit more. So it begins with that kind of philosophy of how do we make sure that things are convenient for folks to get to. So we often describe that as how are we creating flexibility in our land use approaches and encouraging our mixing of uses focused more on intensity. So we describe it a lot of times as this is an intensity-based approach. So how are we matching similar intensity uses adjacent to each other or mixed together with each other? So if we have a residential and a commercial, that the intensity of those uses, the traffic generation, the noises, all of those things should be compatible. The scale of the structures and so forth should all be kind of compatible in their intensity that they have. So when we think about the development of the map itself, it was informed by several things, including our existing land use patterns that we have today out there and how that influences where we are. Adjacency, and this is really important when we think about that compatibility component of it, and how are we making sure that, again, that uses are continue to be compatible adjacent to each other. Infrastructure, where we're at with infrastructure today, what infrastructure we would potentially need into the future to support that growth. And I think this is a really important piece of it too, because we talk about that intensity of use, but one of the things we also heard a lot from the community is how do we continue to make sure that we're holding our growth in. We would like to see that mixing of uses, but we also want to kind of keep our growth in as close to the core of the community, the existing kind of developed areas that we have today, both because we want to protect what is in those kind of undeveloped areas, but also because we want to use our infrastructure as efficiently as possible, right? So that goes back to one of our core development principles. Transportation, where's our transportation system at today? And how do we think about the uses and where they are as it relates to the transportation system? So more intense uses being having very good access to our higher capacity transportation system, but also that connectivity and multiple options for moving around the community. And then finally, the environmental impact and what impact does that growth have? And that really ties a lot back to how do we continue to kind of grow in a little bit different way that allows us to minimize the environmental impact that we have as we grow as a community. So next, kind of moving into the other plan pieces, plan element master plans. And this is where I'm just going to kind of give an overview of what we're sharing tonight at the open houses, so you can see a little bit of what will be happening. So we're going to kind of go through and explain what each of the master plans is. We, at each station, we have a board that talks about kind of the key findings and recommendations that are related to that master plan. Folks will have a chance to hear a little bit about that and then ask questions and have some dialogue and conversation. So I'm not going to read these boards to you. I just wanted to so you could kind of see what's happening with each of the boards. But on the water piece, water study, looked at our supply and alternatives. It looked at alternatives as it relates to potable reuse wells, purchasing from Oklahoma City and new reservoirs, and really is looking at the potential that the most feasible route appears to be related to wells and purchasing and reuse of those alternatives. And then it also looked at assessments for future distribution and the CIP, identifying recommended projects that address growth, but also resiliency in the system and making sure that is maintained. The wastewater system, again, key goal here was just identifying feasible solutions for reclamation, treatment, and collection within the system. Primary findings, expansion and rehab of the existing water reclamation facility really being kind of the direction that the initial recommendations are looking to be going, and that the future infrastructure needs, we need to continue to address both our existing deficiencies and how we're going to deal with growth. Moving on to stormwater, and within the stormwater, looking at the goals here for around the stormwater. Really, we're continuing a lot of what is in the existing stormwater master plan, but looking at water quality, flood risk, ecological character, riparian and recreation areas, community awareness and education and transparency. So those 6 goals being kind of the key focuses, those being the key focuses of the 6 goals. Recommendations initially coming out is continuing to support some additional supporting studies, excuse me, I'll get the words out, that they've begin to identify there's a few things that need to go into kind of additional kind of deeper dive studies. Alternative funding sources, looking at runoff treatment in new development, so how we're handling that in the future, strengthening the WQPZ ordinance, specifically around riparian areas and protection of those areas, and kind of limiting or prohibiting the reduction of width in any of the WQPZs. So how can we continue to take what we've learned from that ordinance being in place and improve that? On the housing study, so the Housing Study Committee has completed its work. It has the draft, it has a plan ready to go. We will be getting that out posted for all of you to be looking at. And kind of key recommendations coming out, or the key goals coming out of the housing study, begin first and foremost with a recommendation that the ordinance needs to be, that our zoning ordinances and subdivision ordinances need to be updated. That's a really important goal that that subcommittee spent quite a bit of time talking about and working through. That we need to add more variety to our housing types across all densities and design approaches. And this is a key thing that we're talking about in every community that we work with, of we need more variety within the market to provide that flexibility and opportunity for people to move and be in the housing that's appropriate for their stage of life. Increasing attainable, accessible, and quality housing options for all folks and all people in our community. Enhancing and promoting the infill opportunities in existing neighborhoods. And then finally, having some clear, understandable, and reasonable housing and incentives and programs to continue to move all of these goals forward. Transportation. So on the transportation side, as we mentioned, we've heard a lot around multimodal, around trail connections, expanding the options that folks have for moving around the community. So here are 5 core goals that have been identified in the transportation plan, focusing on making sure this continues to be a special place to live, and that our transportation system is creating quality neighborhoods and quality places. Mobility, that we have a wide variety of ways that people can move around their community. I was sharing with my brother-in-law this weekend, who is in a wheelchair, that one of the priorities in here is how you roll in the community, and he really appreciated. He doesn't live here, but he appreciated hearing that a plan we were working on was prioritizing that. Maintain and improve our existing infrastructure. Also, just making sure we're fiscally responsible and stewards of how we're handling our expanded needs that we'll have, and then enhancing the economic vitality. So how is transportation continuing to connect with economic development and how we're growing the economic opportunities that we have here in the community? And then just some of the continued major takeaways. We talked about this a little bit, but continuing to find ways that we're expanding those options of how we move around the city. Parks. Parks' big news today is they had their final subcommittee meeting today and made their recommendation on the Parks Master Plan today too. So big cheer to Parks too. So the objectives they've identified in the Parks Master Plan is to maintain and update and improve the park system. They want to continue to support and elevate organizations in the community with regards to arts and culture around Norman, updating and modernizing all of their policies as it relates to the as it relates to the parks, making sure the opportunities for connections and growth. This really does tie, I think, also to, we talk about the transportation system. How are we continuing to connect parks together and connect community members to their parks? Protecting our natural resources too. So, these last two, this is what makes this whole process really special. You start to see how all of these master plans begin to connect together, right? We have our transportation system and how this connects to the land use, but also to our park system and how those pieces are fitting together. Our park system and its role that it has in connecting the community together, but also protecting our sensitive areas and the role that it can begin to play there. So just really exciting to see how all of these pieces are kind of coming together and reinforcing each other, which is the reason you did this whole process in this way. So finally, one of the things, and we'll probably actually start with this tonight, we will talk through the process. I think this is probably something we've shared all with you, so I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this, but just talking through with the community members so they understand how we kind of got to where we are today. It started with understanding our current conditions and where we are at today and where we've been and how we got to where we are. I always joke at this point of, like, as a former history teacher, you got to understand where you've been to understand where you want to go. So that's the kind of Norman today piece of it. And then just the community input, right? We're collecting the data, but we're also taking that qualitative input, working with our subcommittees, developing the development principles, moving into kind of where we are right now with developing each of the plans, lots of feedback loops from our subcommittees as they're wrapping up tonight's event to take more of that community insight and input. And then in the next, after the first of the year, moving into our plan adoption process. So that, I feel like, is like a fire hose of information for all of you. We're happy to answer any questions you have and flip back to anything.
I would like to return to stormwater.
Yeah.
And, I've sat through a lot of the public meetings for the steering committee. But I was curious about the public input on people who are impacted. I know when you were talking earlier about community engagement, roughly 20,000 people had visited the website. Forgot the numbers on polling questions. But when we say 65% of monthly poll participants, do you know how many people that was for that particular question?
Oh, I'm probably going to have to go back and double check that. I do know that the month we did some of our stormwater questions were better months. So
it had a lot more people.
Yeah, it had more people. I want to say off the cuff, and I'm going to look around and see if anybody else remembers, but I think we had over 300 people.
Okay.
But I'd have to double check that number.
And that's citywide, it's not
Yeah.
just particularly
Right.
in the core.
Right, exactly.
And then over 70% of monthly poll participants say flooding and water pollution are the most significant stormwater related challenges. And I did see under key recommendations, alternative funding, so that is kind of gearing us up towards maybe a stormwater utility fee or beginning to talk about it.
Yeah, Howard, there's a lot of things that concerns, issues, opportunities too, of how can we, think about those areas and protect those areas. that we're gonna have to figure out a way to fund that, right?
I mean, currently, we're stuck doing it project by project if we
right.
can, but that doesn't mean, I mean, and there's engineering design criteria as well, but, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious, was alternative funding studied at all in these poll questions?
No, I don't think so. Sorry, it's been a few months since we did the stormwater ones. No, I don't think we did ask one, I think, a little bit about funding, but it wasn't like, here's a list of alternative ways to do it. I do know that.
And then, when we have the open houses, one is tonight in about an hour, and then the next one's tomorrow. When folks come and give input, they'll be giving input on the land use, the character areas, but then also all of these subcommittee, all the work they've done on that.
Right, so there will be a table for each of the master plans, so land use, parks, housing, transportation, and folks can, yeah.
Can we get another update about what that feedback generated, before we get into the adoption phase?
Yes, so our plan tomorrow night at the committee meeting, there will be a report out of all the input that was given. So at each table, there'll be a flip chart at each table at which we're taking notes as the conversations are happening. So that'll be used for tomorrow night at the committee meeting. Then the plan is that we will be recording all of those so that we can post, we'll have the boards posted, those notes posted along with them. And then we will also probably be recording the kind of short presentation we're doing at the beginning. We'll record that, so it'll be all posted as a package on the website, so you'll be able to see all that.
I mean, like, I can go view it, but if people also miss this opportunity to weigh in, could they contact us or the steering
Yes.
committee and say, hey, I'm so sorry I missed out on this opportunity, but I saw.
Right. They also, from the very beginning, folks can submit comments on the website too. So they can go review all that material, and then if they've got comments or questions. The other thing we're doing with each of the boards, I think I actually cropped it off just so I can make these a little bit bigger. But at the top of each one of these boards is the QR code to take you to the website if you want to submit a comment that way. But there's also some contact information, so if you have more questions, there's a staff member that's identified that you can contact, and that's also in their handout. I will say part of the reason too for the QR code is that the plan is to set these boards up in a few different locations around the community so they can have kind of a road show or an afterlife. And at that point, somebody won't be standing there with them. So if folks want to submit a comment, they can do the QR code and submit their comment.
And I would be remiss not to ask about the Griffin master plan.
Sure, yes.
Not maybe a part of this, but coming in the spring?
Yeah, before that. So in February, our schedule right now is to be back to present some information to you in February. We are also looking at, we're still confirming the date, but in January, we might have an opportunity to, if you want to drop in, we'll have a kind of internal working time that we're doing. So we'll keep you posted on that.
In February, I'm just curious about, it's in Ward 4 and
Yeah.
there's surrounding neighborhoods. And I guess actually Ward 6 might be interested because there's some borders there. But will the community have an opportunity to see the Griffin master plan and weigh in on it as well?
Yes, we haven't selected that specific date. That might be a little bit closer to spring, because we would probably, we'll share kind of preliminary kind of draft concepts in February with you and take any feedback from all of you and then incorporate that, and then we can have something ready to share with the public, yeah.
Okay, that's it for me. Thank you so much.
They'll love it though.
I'm eagerly anticipating.
The housing portion,
Yes.
the projected
Yes.
population, new residents by 2045. Could you just maybe talk a little bit about what is that based off of? Is it based off of our historic growth rate over the last 10, 20 years, just in our whole existence, or some other data that is being looked at that suggests that that's what we might grow by over
Yeah.
the next 20 years?
So it is based off of historic growth trends. We also did a pretty deep dive into looking at the university population and the potential impact. I think the other thing that we tried to take into consideration too is that it's a little bit less than if I remember correctly, it's been almost a year since we picked this, but it's a little bit less than maybe what you've seen in a few past decades, but I always describe it as it's a little bit like a compounding interest rate, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as your population base gets bigger, your annual growth rate usually slows down a little bit. You might be adding the same amount of people, but that growth rate slows down a little bit. So we did try to take that into consideration too, as we looked out of like, you couldn't continue to sustain a growth rate that you were maybe at in the 2000s because your base is getting bigger.
And then the how we house that, how we address housing demand for that potential number of people. Does it assume, you touched on it a bit, and I think the answer is no, but does it assume that we need to fit that many more people in using our existing development pattern that we've had since the 50s, basically, where kind of we force everything to be lower, the default is low density, spread out, not the most efficient use of the land we have.
Yeah.
And is it if we just continued developing under that old pattern, we'd have to use a lot more land to fit that many people. But as you mentioned, kind of the discussion has been, how can we make the best use out of land, infrastructure we've already servicing?
Yeah.
And going forward, how can we make it so the default isn't lowest spread out, where it's very flexible, like you said.
Yep, and we did kind of illustrate that scenario to folks so they can see, like, if you continue to grow in the way you have, this is, we're going to have to consume a lot more land to support that growth. And so what we heard clearly, both from the public and our steering committee, is that is not the way we want to grow. We want to grow in a more efficient way. But I think growing in a more efficient way is a piece of it. I think it's also, the other piece of it is we want to find ways that we're continuing to create high quality neighborhoods where we've got access to the destinations, to the services, to our schools, all of those things. And we want to grow in a pattern that allows us to create really great neighborhoods, but also grow more efficiently.
More incremental type growth where it's not like an either or, where we limit growth or we limit expansion on the edge and we just wipe out all the existing neighborhoods and build big apartments.
Exactly.
That's not what we're trying to do either.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and this goes back to one of the housing goals. How are we creating more housing options? That many cities over the last decade have either built a lot of single-family detached homes or high-density residential, and there really hasn't been as much kind of in the spectrum in between. Even smaller lot single-family and attached single-family units. We haven't historically done that much here in the Midwest, and so how do we continue to grow in a different way so we've got more options too, because that's going to make a healthier housing market to have more options, but it also means that we're growing in a more efficient manner too.
And making sure that if we do develop current green space, or greenfield, that we're doing it in a way that again, not the entire thing is going to be a 10-story apartment block, but that a more efficient way that we're getting more out of the existing space so that we can not have to develop all of our open space.
And quality spaces where we do have green space, and that green space is being used to protect our stormwater. And
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. On the exact same thing, do you have the demographics of this 57,000 people that we're expected to grow by? Because that's very important, because a group of 20-year-olds, if it's the majority, need completely different services, and a 35-year-old set of families than a retiring age.
Sure.
As well as the income levels, because people below the poverty line definitely need different resources and things in their community than somebody making $150,000 a year. So how does that play into all this?
Well, it's hard to predict what the future demographic makeup could potentially look at. I will say that probably what we heard in the community input process was you know, we have our student population, and we have a lot of individuals who are in their empty nester or later years who like to call Norman home. But we struggle sometimes to attract those families, young professionals and families. The young professionals looking for not what the students, they don't want what they had as students, they wanted a little bit different entertainments and those sorts of things. And then the young families, and you can see the young family piece in the school enrollment, which has been pretty steady. So what we heard was, how do we begin to create an environment that expands that diversity and maybe opens up more options for our young families and young professionals? And I think a lot of that does go back to how do we continue to make sure we've got housing options for that every stage of life.
Yeah, and I completely agree.
Yeah.
Because density is one thing, so we have to grow somewhere.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we have to maintain that quality of life. And people choose the Midwest, people choose Oklahoma, because we have that.
Right.
We have that atmosphere, and people want a yard, and a place to raise their kids. Yeah, I just wondered how much that was actually being taken into consideration, because that's a huge piece of it. So I'm very curious and looking forward to how it all
Yeah.
turns out and what we come up with. So.
I would also make the point that probably by 2045 to 2050, the demographics population in terms of age distribution will look a lot like it is today.
Right. Well, because it blows my mind. I've talked to Dr. Nick, our superintendent, and he doesn't expect us to need any more schools, not even another elementary school in the next 20 years.
Yeah.
And for a population growing 50,000 people, I don't want my kids, shoved in with an extra 20 kids.
Yeah.
And but it doesn't look like that's an issue, I guess.
But millennials in 25 years will be the equivalent of baby boomers. And so on down the line, so,
Okay.
Just want to drill down on the comment you made about the zoning ordinances and subdivision regulations. Definitely agree that those need an overhaul. They haven't been overhauled in 70 years, and I think cities have definitely changed in that time frame. So fully support whatever staff needs to do to make that happen. On that note, one of the policy things we're talking about is reducing the minimum lot size required in Norman. So I don't necessarily have a number to give you today, but I just want the committees to be aware that, we're not always going to have the current minimum lot size that we have right now. So in an effort to increase more density with the land that we have, I just want to make sure that's definitely done.
Other thoughts or comments, or I guess what kind of interests me when we talk about an interest curve or anything, a compounding interest curve and things like that, we assume a straight line, but it really isn't, because there are other factors that'll affect that. If there aren't enough houses, the slope changes and it goes down, and it may be just punctuated with little things. But it's an interesting thing to me where people are moving more towards renting houses for longer times. We rented, when we were married, we rented a house for a couple of years, got up enough money, and then bought a house. And so actually rented a duplex. That model seems to be changing, where people are wanting to live in somewhere where they're not maintaining the grass, they're not maintaining the flower beds and all the rest of that, and they want to pay into those kinds of living arrangements. Not for me, but that's fine. It's hard to throw a dart at such a moving line that's up there, and I think you guys have done enough work that we ought to have at least a fair shot at hitting that line or close to it. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to touch back on community input and why we're not growing in some of these rural areas. I noticed that I think the proposed turnpike, those are on the map. And I know there was like a town hall to meet with people who were concerned, but overall, what's coming forward and what people will see in these open houses is respect to what that community feedback is, correct?
Yes, we're trying as hard as we can, to balance all of those things in the most reasonable way possible.
So people come out if they're concerned. I mean, I know one of those lines may move anyway. The other one seems kind of pretty much set in stone at this point. But folks will have the opportunity to see the thoughtful way that the steering committee and the subcommittees have envisioned growth when it is expanding into the green space.
Yes, I think so, I hope so, and I would re-emphasize your point there of the thoughtful way, I mean, that the committee and subcommittees have put to this. They've spent a lot of time and really wanting to emphasize that and try to get it right.
I would say that the land use map actually involved a subcommittee that met, I mean, a subcommittee
Working group.
that met about, 5 or 6 times, and really quite literally looked at each piece of ground that was undeveloped and thought specifically about the future of that and the range of densities that it would support. So, so, you look at a map like that and say, well, that, might look arbitrary, or why is this, that, and that a different color? But actually, every parcel virtually that's open for development was discussed. It's very interesting. These plans rarely get that detailed, but
I'm super appreciative to the land use group.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, same with that. That's definitely the type of detail I was looking for out of this process for sure. Because one of the questions that, I've been asking other council members, other cities around the country are asking is, with growth, is the growth we're getting the type of growth that generates enough revenue to actually support and maintain the infrastructure it takes to service that? And so like on a per square mile basis, if there's a square mile in Norman that is currently undeveloped, and we allow the entire square mile to be developed, and we have to widen the section line roads on all 4 sides of it to 4 or 5 lanes or whatever, and add sidewalks and curb and gutter and drainage and lighting and all that stuff, traffic signals at all 4 corners. At full build out of that square mile, would that full build out and the people living in it, would they ever generate enough revenue per acre to cover the cost of paying for the infrastructure and then maintaining it forever? And that's just one of the questions I think a lot of cities are asking is, and we've talked about here in Norman, is our population has doubled in the last 40 years from like 65,000 to now 130 plus. But we still have issues with budgets. We still have issues with city staffing and, trying to complete infrastructure projects like road widening and road improvement, or, we thankfully, voters have approved water rate increases and wastewater increase. We've been able to invest in upgrading our treatment facilities in the last decade. But is the growth we have paying for itself? Or do we have to, like many cities, go into debt through bond programs to pay for maintenance of our expanding infrastructure? And so trying to get down into that detail is definitely what I was looking for, and having every piece of property in Norman analyzed and that isn't developed, and saying what type of development would best support the infrastructure it takes to service that area forever once we do develop it. So,
and Councilmember Holman, that is the unenviable task placed on the shoulders of our elected officials, because the reality is the population happens, and there's very little we can do. I mean, we could just not issue any more building permits. That doesn't change the demand. Supply and demand and prices go up, and you're challenged with how do we hang on to some level of affordability for a portion of our population that would otherwise just, sorry, you have to move now, you can't afford to live in Norman anymore. And that thought of, does that section pay, will it pay for itself? The reality of, well, you can pay now, or boy, you can pay later. We are fortunate that our voters have approved those GO bonds for road maintenance and things like that. And there's probably hundreds of different formulas for how cities and counties pay for services, it seems like, under that section fully developed, right now, the lion's share of that tax revenue is ad valorem. And we're not the benefactors of great planning on your part. If council says we're gonna wind up with greater density, you will probably wind up with much greater value, assessed value in that same section of land. And some other agency is gonna benefit pretty dramatically and will actually increase wear and tear on that section line road all the way around it, and increase wear and tear on the sewer system and the water system, because we got a lot more people in that same footprint. So, yeah, the ability over time as us in Oklahoma to say, we really need to look at that model.
Yep.
Because it doesn't incentivize your goals and objectives. It's almost counterintuitive. We're incentivized to build differently.
Well, and that's, kind of like Edmond is finding themselves in a situation where they've always relied on their general tax revenue to pay for maintenance, and now they proposed multiple bond issues, one to do road maintenance like we have, and their voters said no. And now what do? And I wonder what would Norman do if voters had not approved the street maintenance bond in 2006 and then renewed it every 5 years since then, or approved the street enhancement bond that paid for West Lindsay Street and Cedar Lane and 12th Avenue and all these other projects, the sewer excise tax that we have, the bridge maintenance bond. Like, what would the city of Norman do
Look like.
if voters had said no to all those things? Our general tax revenue would never be able to pay for
Not that
many
level of
of, hardly
maintenance.
any of those projects. And so if we kept having population growth, what would we be doing if we didn't have these programs? But these programs are bond debt, and so we're paying a lot of interest in debt to maintain stuff. So is it really a sustainable system that way?
So in that thought, if we really increase density in that section and land values and assessed values go up pretty dramatically just because we're building taller and more dense, at least that tax rate on that maintenance bond question could be lower per taxpayer.
And density
What a
isn't
rabbit hole we could take ourselves down. to
I
try
mean,
to
New York
figure out
City,
that
I'm
formula.
sure, has budget problems.
Yeah,
Even
and,
though,
and no more
Yes,
dense
they do.
development anywhere else in the country.
yeah, even though it's the densest city in the country, maybe. So it's not like that solves any problem. But I think that's an issue that a lot of cities are trying to think about: is how do we, if we build all this infrastructure, how do we maintain it, and without relying on debt and financing and voters saying yes or no and maybe not saying yes.
We can answer that with what you see in North Dallas and all the rest of those, where North Dallas was that flood 20 years ago of construction. Now 20 years worth of pavement is being torn up and remodeled and
Yeah.
done again. And it is nothing but confusion. I think that's our interest in the RTA. That's what sparks me so much with that, because regional transportation with good hubs at places where people really want to go will save those roads, save the other kinds of things, and give us the way of being able to move 80 people in a car instead of 1 people in a car. And so it's anti-Oklahoma to think that way. But if we don't get there, we're gonna be in trouble, because I know Chris and I have talked about the idea of expanding sewer lines and water lines past 48th Street, basically. And yeah, I know some of them go to 60th, but it doesn't pencil out. And even if you densified that, unless you have Matt's idea of having all mixed use kinds of things where we have tax generators, even though they're small, in the same area that they're working, seems to be a good building block. I've never seen it in practice. I'm sure it is.
Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that mixing of the less car dependency, right? Hopefully, if they're, if people have options where they can comfortably walk or ride their bike or scooter, or hopefully that is less wear and tear on your streets. And, a couple of our committee members have also noted, let's emphasize what that means for air quality too, if people are choosing not to take fewer trips or have the RTA as an option and what that also means for the environment too.
Yeah, one other interesting issue, and this is written into the transportation element, is that an intelligently designed road system, that is with alternative routes and networks and so forth, that's kind of built through collectors that are interconnected and so forth, really helps, because it means that the section lane arterials are not the only way of getting from point A to point B, but there are other ways of diverting local trips. And so the wear and tear, as it were, spread out over more miles of street than all being focused into the main arterials.
Yeah, that's a part of like Oklahoman, we like freedom, right? So to me, freedom is having multiple options.
Yeah,
If your only option is you
precisely.
have to drive every single day all the way across Norman,
You're trapped in a
then
car.
you don't have a choice. That's not really freedom, right? And I don't think we're trying to force anybody to ride that train or bus, but having that option so you can choose whatever fits you best today. And you know, a lot of people that live around downtown Norman have cars and drive, but they have the ability when they feel like it or want to, they can walk to the diner or walk to City Hall. And then when they want to, they get in their car and drive to the west side or whatever. So
But you have to explain to me the conundrum. Why every time I cannot buy a nut or a bolt on the west side, I have to drive all the way to the east side to go to Ace to get
I
that
don't know,
one
that's weird.
29 cents. Yes, sir.
I was just gonna dovetail on that, you know, you often think of transit systems as like a food chain, and if you don't have every link in the chain, the thing is not sustainable. And so you've gotta have apex predators and bottom feeders and everything in between. And so city building is just the same way. Your comment about separating uses, there's an analogy called the bento box analogy. I'm sure you're familiar with what a bento box is. But basically, that's what we've done with modern city planning. You take a bento box and you put cheese in one, pizza dough in one, pepperoni in another compartment, sauce in one, and you call the whole thing pizza. We've basically compartmentalized uses across the city to be that kind of bento box, and it just doesn't work. And so, yeah, mixing the uses, having different housing types with different commercial types, I think it all makes sense. And it's how cities have historically been developed over the past 100 years. And so we just, in the 50s or 60s, when the advent of the car came around, we decided there was a better way, or thought there was a better way.
California did it to us.
That's right.
Amy, can you back
Famous
up to the build environment map? That one. This is the only place where that visual, I'm gonna have Dr. Joyce make me a big one for my office. It really shows the limitations of what is available to us in terms of developable opportunities. Because most of those waterways are invisible to us. We see little tiny channels, or we don't even recognize we're on a bridge when we're actually on a bridge over one of those waterways. But it makes, if we wanted to facilitate development closer to those lines, it would be cost prohibitive to develop too close to any of those waterways. The amount of investment you'd have to make to keep your property, your development from flooding would cause you to go elsewhere. And that's the best depiction of our buildable reality that I've seen. So, yeah, I've taken mental note. I'm gonna have Dr. Joyce make me a big one of those. That's a great depiction. Yes, sir.
one of the other factors too, like you mentioned with wastewater. So we made a big $55 million upgrade to the treatment plant 6 or 7 years ago, voter approved. And I think it was the largest infrastructure project the city's ever done to deal with wastewater. And some of the discussion about another treatment plant on the north side and the idea of, you know, expanding what we have or building a new one. And some of the discussion about that has been that even if we expand the existing one, there's only so big of a pipe that you can get everything in the whole city to go through to get to it. But also the cost of building a new one being 100 million, maybe plus. And where would we get money to do that? Would voters approve something like that for one big mega project? Would we be able to get outside funding for something like that? So that's a big factor too. And if we did how would we pay, would it be a bond and we're paying interest on $100 million? And what does that cost per person in the city of Norman and overtime and those kind of factors that, you know, I like the idea of expanding what we have versus building a brand new one and then having to operate and and staff two separate plants. But I also understand that the existing plant, even if expanded, may not have the ability to service the whole city if it keeps growing.
Well, our subcommittee is kind of leaning towards what you're saying, not building a north plant. Actually, they're finding it more cost effective to just kind of do the lift station things and continue to grow the big south plant.
Chris, did they talk about the prior elections?
A little bit, but not much. They're really just looking at what's the best way to go forward.
I would be totally remiss. That's one of the things my father-in-law gripes at me about constantly. About we voted to have a second wastewater treatment plant and you never built it. So it's a little bit of a trust factor with regard to us on that issue. Is people believe that they voted for that and we never built it. So that's one we have to be careful about.
It's just not
Technology's
cost
gotten better.
effective. Not cost effective.
Technology's gotten better, all kinds of other things have gotten better, and that plant's become more efficient over the years.
Yeah.
Saved $100 million. Is that a good number?
Well, if I recall, what voters may have approved then is not enough to cover the cost of actually building something like that. And then issues with the Little River and raw sewer pipeline running across it. I don't know, other environmental issues that I think came up, but I'm definitely familiar with that. And, you know, I guess what ended up happening was an expansion of the existing facility that expanded capacity and had regulatory upgrades to it as well. But so yet we got the capacity, we're just maybe wasn't in a separate plant. So, but I appreciate that. I think that's a good one for us to think about.
Anything else? Well, thank you, Miss Amy.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
It's,
Appreciate being here.
Looking forward. It's gonna be neat to read the whole report in one book, instead of reading it by chapters and putting it down for a year. Back up. All right, we'll meet again at